Welcome to the Blue Yonder Overland podcast. I'm your host, Jen, and our goal is to inspire and empower you to get more nights under the stars, however that looks for you, but especially to make overlanding more approachable. Each week, we provide practical advice for vehicle-based adventures, either focused on a topic or featuring interviews with people who are out there doing it, sharing lessons learned, and empowering you to spend more nights under the stars. Feel free to send us any questions or comments at blueyondergen at Instagram or Threads, and hopefully we'll see you out in the wild blue yonder. Welcome back to the Blue Yonder Overland podcast for our episode 11. Today we're going to be talking all about overlanding vehicle setups, and I'm lucky enough to have my husband, Matt, here with me.
Hey everyone, good to be back.
So Matt and I have evolved our own setup a lot over the years, and I'll be starting out by just asking Matt kind of how he got started with figuring out his overland rig setup. But as you get into the overlanding community, I think it's one of those things you'll find that people are constantly tinkering with their setups and trying to optimize them for all the adventures that they want to do. And it's also the type of thing that can change over time as people's needs evolve, as their family evolves, as the type of camping that they like to do evolves. And so it's one of those topics that you're never really done with. In overlanding, you're kind of always thinking about this. And even if you think you have your adventure rig perfectly dialed in, there's probably a small part of you at the back of your mind that's already dreaming up your next iteration of what your adventure rig looks like. Does that sound right to you, Matt?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting example in like everything has compromises. And when you're going out and doing something in the overlanding space and you're having a vehicle for it, there's going to be certain things that you give up and certain things that you do really well. And deciding what is important to you and where those compromises should be made will help drive the decision. And like Jen, like you were saying, over time, those things may change.
Yeah. So I guess on that note, let's discuss just a little bit about the vehicle and setup that you got into overlanding with, because I think listeners would like to know kind of your own journey. And we do have a good, I think, highlight reel or whatever of this on Instagram that also shows some of the behind the scenes evolution. But just to kind of walk us through how you got started and what decisions you made to build it out, just the very first iteration of your overlanding setup.
Yeah, so I started with a Forester and a rooftop tent. And it was really just deciding if this is what I wanted to do and figuring it out, sort of build. So I didn't really do any modifications to the Forester. I just sort of put a rooftop tent on it and got out and went. And then gradually over time, as I learned different lessons and figured out things that either, were pain points or things that would provide for more enjoyment, I looked to solve that particular problem. So, that looked like evolving the rooftop tent that I had. That looked like getting a truck instead of the Forester. And that looked like changes in how I built out the truck.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I think that just speaks to the first point that we're making, that it 100% will evolve over time. And I think it ties in really well with just the mentality of it really doesn't matter how you get started. The important thing is just to go and to get out there. Because if you obsess over your perfect rig at the beginning, you probably don't even know what you want yet if you haven't done a lot of overlanding. And the more you do, the more you'll figure out, like Matt said, what's important to you and where you're okay with compromising. So I think that's the main lesson, is just get out there and whatever you can.
Yep, 100%.
So that's, I think, going to structure then a little bit about how we talk through these categories today. And if you go online, you'll see tons of forums and Reddits and whatever discussing just, what's the best 4x4 or what's the best pickup. And we are not going to go into vehicle specifics today. We're really going to pull it back and take the 30,000 foot view and kind of compare footprints or platforms of overlanding vehicles in general. So what we're going to talk through is kind of the pros and cons of just simply getting started with whatever vehicle you have and some sort of ground tent. We'll talk about then the pros and cons of sleeping inside your vehicle, which then leads us into an integrated sleeping setup that might be built on top of a pickup. Also will lead us to talk about vans, which also have an integrated sleeping setup. And then we'll go into the rooftop tent world and some of the pros and cons of that. And then look at overlanding trailers and what are the pros and cons of that. So we're kind of approaching it from what exactly is your sleeping setup, and is it separate or connected with the vehicle you're driving? And then we'll also talk through those sort of kitchen and bathroom setups and whether those are integrated or separate, which will have some of the same pros and cons.
Sounds great.
So let's start with vehicles with just simply ground tents. You might already have this for your once a year family camping trip or camping in a campground, but it's probably something that someone in your family probably already has a tent like this on hand. You throw it in your vehicle, you go find some trails or dispersed sites, and you're good to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the easiest. It's really where I got started before the rooftop tent. I had a ground tent. We went out camping. We never dispersed camp. I sort of knew just from setting up tents at campgrounds that finding a level spot is hard to do and all that. It definitely is, though, the lowest barrier of entry.
Yep.
And is totally doable. I mean, I remember there's a great YouTuber out there, Conquest Overland, and he, in part of changing his setup, ended up back in a ground tent for a while he was waiting for his GFC camper to be ready. It was sort of back in COVID times and long delays. And it was interesting listening as he went from a rooftop tent back to a ground tent and just sort of the things that he did for that. And so it's a totally doable thing. But I think, in the dispersed world, the unavailability of level ground or of sort of cleaned up tent pad areas is pretty small, and so having either moving to the next stage, which is in your vehicle or with a rooftop tent, is definitely a good place to start.
A couple other pros that come to mind in hearing you discuss that is just the fact that you could leave your tent and go use your vehicle to do activities. That's a plus. As well as if you've got anybody with mobility concerns or maybe you've got pets along, then maybe bringing a ground tent is the way to go for that specific situation. Certainly easier for kids to get in and out of than, say, a rooftop tent.
Yep.
But then on the con side, the ground tent's a lot more susceptible to elements, wind, weather than a lot of the other overland camping solutions out there.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of ground tents. You'll find a lot of ground tents have, they'll say they'll have a rain guard or they'll be sort of semi-rain proof or good for inclement weather. But they're really not. I mean, in general, they're a piece of nylon. They maybe have some fabric protection, sort of chemicals, DWR or something like that. But holding up to the rain, even with a rain fly, they don't tend to do that great of a job. Some are definitely better than others. And if you live in an area like a Pacific Northwest or anything where you might get a little bit of rain, they could very quickly become drenched or soaked and just sort of make for a harder camping environment. Definitely doable, but it's, in my mind, a big con.
For sure, living in the Pacific Northwest, and also just thinking of the other big con is just the setup and teardown time involved. So pack up a ground tent and pack up your rig. And then especially if you have had any moisture, then that's just an extra pain. Then you got to worry about drying it out. And with all of that, then obviously you're going to have separate cooking and bathroom solutions. So you're probably very quickly going to run out of room in your vehicle too. That could be the other thing, is it just takes up a lot of storage space as well.
Yep.
That's about all the pros and cons I could think of for just starting off with a vehicle with a tent. But like we say, it's a great place to get started. Similarly, I think a lot of folks, we talked to my sister Megan, your sister Alex, both got their start sleeping in their vehicle. something like a 4x4, an SUV. And so obviously that changes things in terms of you're a little more wind and weather resistant for your sleeping arrangement, which is nice. The thing they both mentioned as well was just sort of there is a sense of security sleeping inside your vehicle. You could lock the vehicle, but it also is just sort of that harder shell around you to protect you from the elements or animals or whatever. And so that could be just a nice pro.
Yeah, this is one I didn't really think about as an option back when I got started. But given the opportunity to do it again and go, dispersed camping for the first time, this would have been the path that I would have taken. As far as cost compared to rooftop tents, or even a ground tent that is more suited towards dispersed camping, and there are some out there, you won't find them at like an REI, but if do some internet research, there are some good products out there. The general cost of equipping your vehicle to sleep comfortably inside could be almost nothing to less than $1,000, and a lot of that depends on exactly what vehicle and what you have to do, but there's also just a ton of products out there really designed around this solution.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And so despite the fact that you're still dealing with a relatively small space, there's a lot of cool products, things I'm thinking through where like deck and drawer type of systems to allow you to just easily store a bunch of stuff more permanently and then to make a level sleeping platform. A lot of stuff that's been coming out in recent years. We saw a really cool integrated kitchen at Overland Expo. I'll have to grab the link to the exhibitor for that. And put that in the show notes at blueyonder-adventures.com for all of our links. But yeah, there's a lot of really cool solutions for integrating directly into your vehicle with not only your sleeping space, but starting to think through maybe kitchen storage or a pull-out kitchen. You probably still have to separately bring the kitchen and bathroom areas or extra stuff and kind of set it up outside the vehicle. And so it kind of comes then with a con of it can be harder to transition from camp activities to shuttling you to places to do, whether it's mountain biking or hiking or other activities, because you might have to do a little more rearranging and kind of setting up, packing or whatever to get the space, especially if you've got passengers with you for things like activities.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, if you're going to be sleeping in the car, you will have the transition of stuff you stored that will have to move outside of the vehicle and spend its time outside the vehicle overnight because you are going to be taking up some of that storage space. And like you said, there are some solutions around drawers and stuff where that isn't the case. But I remember camping with my sister, and yeah, there were a couple bins that started in the car, moved out of the car, and then she set up her sleep thing. And then if we were on the move, then you put away the sleep pad or whatever, and you put those bins back in. And so there is, the security side of whatever that is, thinking about food and stuff like that. Or if you are going out and adventuring from your campsite, the need to either locate your stuff back in the vehicle or secure it so it doesn't get grabbed on its way. Someone's driving by.
Good point. Okay. So that starts to think about integrated sleeping solutions, but that's, thinking about most cars or SUVs, but a van is kind of a horse of a different color, simply because you have so much more space to work with and can build it out. So in terms of pros, it offers a lot of the same pros that we just talked about especially for the sleeping setup, the integrated security, you're more wind and weather resistant. But with the van, you also have more room not only for storage, but oftentimes can integrate your kitchen and sometimes the bathroom setup as well into your van setup. So you truly are wholly contained, which then gives you a lot more privacy, but also makes you completely weatherproof. So if you wake up and it's pouring rain, you can do everything within the comfort of your own van, which is nice. Any other pros I forgot?
I mean, there's definitely a reason vans are as popular as they are and continuing to grow. I mean, there's tons of van makers out there doing some really cool stuff. And then lots of great content around people doing their own custom vans at home and building them out. And the convenience, the comfort that comes with a van is excellent. Yeah, it's just then dealing with some of the cons that come with it, vehicle size, ground height, rooftop height, and in general width of the vehicles can make it tough in tight spots, Pacific Northwest spots. Some places where like a Tacoma might not be limited, but your big 8-foot, 9-foot tall van that's as wide as a F-150 could have some problems.
Yeah. Well, and then I think that gets into some of the cons. So not only might you have trouble parking it, especially if you live in an urban environment and you're getting started in overlanding and worried about something like a parking garage downtown, but you also may find that depending on how you've chosen to set up the van and deal with suspension and wheels, you might be slightly more limited in the off-road trails and trail networks that you can get onto versus like a 4x4 or an SUV, just because a lot of the vans start out just a little more limited probably in the range of types of terrain and roads you'd be able to conquer without some significant upgrades.
Yeah.
Not to say that they can't be made into just an absolute beast of a machine. We saw some amazing examples at Overland Expo.
Yep.
So,
and that really comes into the other con, which is just your baseline price point. I sort of think of the van as the final upgrade or the pro upgrade. I've done this for a little while. I sort of know that those are the compromises I want to make, or I've tried some rentals and it's worked out great, stuff like that. It would be definitely interested if you could get a van builder on here and just talk through vans in more details. I'm sure the listeners would enjoy that.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I would say then the last con I would mention for the van is similar to any sort of integrated setup where, again, you can't necessarily easily use the van for shuttling activities like taking your group to go hiking or biking without kind of packing up and sort of securing stuff. It's a lot faster than if you had to like pack up your sleeping area because the van is laid out with more room to start with, but you might have to tie down, secure stuff, kind of close things up to use that vehicle. And then with dispersed camping, you might lose your site if you abandon the site using your van as your sort of activity vehicle.
Yeah, this is sort of a big downside that I see with a lot of setups, and something that when we made the decisions we did to go with the trailer, it was one of the primary things. There's just a very low chance that you can camp in the near walking vicinity of something that you want to do. I mean, usually it's just restricted because if they didn't restrict it, everyone would camp there and it would become a disaster.
So the trailhead parking lots will be like day use only.
Yeah, day use only, no camping signs, stuff like that. And we've gotten definitely some great spots that were within a half mile or a mile or two, but
2 miles.
when you're talking along, like we've biked to a trailhead, we've walked to trailheads, it just adds a little bit to it. And so we did the trailer specifically so that because we do camp with the idea of doing other activities, we prioritized that and made the compromises that come along with it.
Yeah. So moving on to think about another category, slightly different, would be an integrated pickup truck topper. And these have some of the same pros and cons as being integrated with your vehicle in general, I think. But some of them are also pop-up, which then leads us towards a rooftop tent pros and cons. Before we specifically talk about rooftop tents, Matt, are there anything that sticks out to you if you had a sort of integrated pickup truck topper that would be different than integrated with your vehicle? Besides just more room, I guess that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, so it all ends up coming down to packing in your general system and setup. If you are integrating your sleep space into your storage space, then your ability to do whatever you want with the storage space goes away.
Yeah.
So if I have to crawl into my sleeping space through the truck bed, then, I can't just load everything I want into the truck bed. I have to think around that. And you've seen our truck bed go from time to time. Sometimes if we're going out with a huge group or whatever, I've got the thing packed to the gills.
Yeah.
So some of that just becomes more difficult. But there's certainly a lot of pros too. I mean, the ability to get in and out without going outside. If weather is really bad, being able to have sort of a cassette toilet or something integrated or in the truck bed.
Or maybe you keep in your jet boil or a hot plate, something where you can boil your coffee in the morning without getting outside of the back of your truck, again, for inclement weather, but also for privacy reasons, might be an advantage for you. But otherwise, I think it's a lot of the same pros and cons that we kind of already talked about. Unless it has a little pop-up area, which then I think gets into the territory of rooftop tent pros and cons. And we're also very familiar with the rooftop tent pros and cons, since that is the direction that Matt originally was building his Overland rig for. So I think there's a lot of pros to the rooftop tent or a pop-up thing on the back of your truck that maybe gives you a little more room. Obviously, then it gives you more room for sleeping, but it's also really easy set up and tear down for the sleeping portion, a lot faster than setting up a tent, say. And you could usually leave pillows, bedding, etc. already up there, ready to go at a moment's notice. Other things that I think are a huge pro with the rooftop tent is just the elevated views. So especially in the Pacific Northwest, there's tons of trees, but sometimes you might get a little peekaboo scenic vista or view if you do have that rooftop tent, giving you just a little bit of extra height, which is fun, which also then can lead to a little extra privacy depending on where you are. Any other pros that are at the top of your mind, Matt, for a rooftop tent?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to what you said, the just general thickness of the mattress and extra comfort that comes along with that. I think when you look at our current rooftop tent, you've got a 4 or 5 inch mattress in there we added some additional like egg crate foam, memory foam to it. And so really comfortable. Whereas if you're integrating into another solution or using a tent, you're just not going to get that quite that thick. So that's really great. The other one I would throw into is ventilation.
Yeah.
There's tons of space for ventilation and no two rooftop tents are, well, there's so many different types of rooftop tents out there. I think, that could be an episode all by itself, looking at the give and takes of the many different general shapes and sizes out there. And each of those then has their own sort of advantages and disadvantages within the category.
Yeah. But for sure, I was actually going to mention wind or ventilation as a pro, but also a con. In the summer when it's hot, it is amazing to get a cross breeze going through a rooftop tent, and you can really cool off really nicely. But then transitioning to the cons, you're also so susceptible if the wind does pick up overnight. It might make it not only very loud, but quite uncomfortable because it will take the brunt of the wind if you're elevated off the ground, even more so, I think, than a ground tent.
Yep. Any little research on rooftop tents and you'll hear people with wind stories.
So in addition to that, also obviously somewhat weather susceptible, more so than, say, being inside a vehicle or being inside a van, certainly. But a lot of the rooftop tents are also really well constructed. And so things that you might think would be a problem, if you choose the right one, you might be able to mitigate a lot of that. For instance, rain. We have never had a problem with rain in our rooftop tent.
Yep. Yeah, we've got the Bush Company Alpha tent, which is quite a heavy duty, really thick canvas, has an amazing rainfly. It was that rainfly was the reason I got it, because my first tent, which was a Tepui high box, when the rain came from the side, water got in the tent and it wasn't fully protected quite the way that the new Bush Company is. there is certainly, anytime you have canvas or something, it has to dry. And we have run into the issue of the tent being wet and then the Pacific Northwest not giving us time to dry it. And, that's just one of the things to think about. But
Yeah, especially based on where you live and sort of what the weather is and what seasons you're going to be choosing to camp in too.
We stay dry, but the tent does not.
Yeah, that's for sure. We have to kind of pay attention when we get home of like, oh, there's going to be a couple hours of sun. Quick, let's open up the tent and let it dry out, and something to be very conscious of.
And I've gone as far as taking a space heater up there, plugging it into an extension cord and, more quickly drying things out.
Yeah.
That works well.
Another con is just having to close up the tent to be able to use the vehicle as a shuttle to go do activities. And so it's not like you can just leave camp set up, but you do have to close it. And in a lot of the rooftop tents, like I said, it's an advantage. They tear down much quicker than a ground tent for sure. But you still have to go through that kind of close up process if you're going to use the vehicle because it's connected.
Yep. And that's where, if you are looking at rooftop tents, if there was the first consideration that I would make, that's the one to look at.
How quickly you can set up and tear down.
Yeah, because some of them are much slower, where you're going to be really hesitant and you're going to make decisions around not having to do that. And whereas if you go with a clamshell or if you go with like one of the roof space varieties, they close up much quicker. And so I don't really mind knowing that it's going to take 30 seconds to a minute to close up.
Yeah.
We just do it and go.
Yep, that's a good point. So then I think that leads us right into the last category that we were thinking of, which is trailers. And so the big pro is that you can leave the trailer at your campsite and use your vehicle for all the shuttling activities that you want to do. And I would say this is one of the big considerations for us when we were thinking about it, since we did so much mountain biking and so much cross-country skiing, was we were constantly leaving camp, wanting to kind of leave it set up, but being able to use our vehicle.
Yeah. I think if I had to put two big reasons why we ended up with the trailers, one, that what you said, and two, the ability to sort of have a truck be our truck and have the ability for our truck to be our camping tool. Whereas if we did a more one-piece sort of build out, then that means that the truck becomes potentially a little more limited. So making that shift was definitely one of the reasons that we did. And trailers come with some cons. The towing is more work. You have to think about it, backing things in, how you make turns, even what gas stations you go to, stuff like that. Just, it's not hard, but it's just one more little thing to think about that you don't necessarily have to with other things. And then the general cost of, one, acquiring the trailer, and two, operating with it. For longer trips, your sort of worst gas mileage will come from towing versus having an integrated solution or even a van. And then having a vehicle platform that's capable of towing it as well.
Yeah. Well, and then you alluded to this, but just with the additional things to think through when towing, it makes it slightly less nimble for off-road maneuvering. It's definitely given us pause. If we are exploring new trails, we much prefer to have the truck without the trailer. It's much easier to go back to a known trail network or road network with the trailer if we've already scouted it without it, just because it's looking for turnaround points is something that will be very top of mind for you if you are exploring a new road with a trailer. Just to avoid having to unhook and turn around, you're going to be constantly scouting, okay, where could I do a 3-point turn with a trailer?
Yep. Yeah. I think there have been times where with the truck just by itself, we have backed out for a half mile or a mile, and it's annoying, but it's doable. I think the longest we've backed out with a trailer is 100 yards, 150 yards, and that was still a lot of work. And I happen, because of my work with CampWorks, have a lot of experience backing up trailers and moving trailers around, so it was doable. But yeah, certainly you're far more limited. Your traction characteristics and everything change. We went out in the snow in Colorado, and I hadn't, I've driven the truck just by itself in the snow and with chains. And so I wanted to just get some experience. And so just feeling the difference. And, it definitely limits the truck's ability to get deep into snow,
Yeah.
even with the chains on. So yeah, it changes that. And then I would say the other thing is nighttime scouting or getting to a spot at night. Far less willing to tackle difficult obstacles or stuff. I tend not to like to do it at night anyway, but I will if I don't have the trailer. If I have the trailer, like when we were just in New Mexico,
Yeah.
sort of looked up a thing in the morning. I looked at it, oh, this is where I would have been fine. But at night, I'm not going to tackle it. And so you just have to make those trade-offs.
Yeah. Definitely makes us a little more cautious, I think, in our exploration if we're towing that trailer. But then just to circle back to the pros, we alluded to this, that obviously a hard-sided trailer, you are better protected from the wind and weather than in any sort of tent or rooftop tent. But then also the privacy and the quiet. And I've talked about this a couple times on here too. It's just not only the thermal insulation of a trailer, but also the acoustic insulation. I'm such a light sleeper that I love the extra barrier. But if you're somebody who really wants to, feel the breeze on your face or feel like you actually are sleeping outside, then you might miss the ventilation of a tent. So we've actually got now roll down screen doors that we can use when it's nice out, so that we kind of get the best of both worlds with the trailer. We can close up and have it be totally hard-sided, or we can have the screens so that we've got a little cross ventilation and hearing sort of the sounds of where we're camping. If we're camping by a river, that's a really nice soundtrack to sleep to.
Certainly.
So I think those are all the pros and cons I can think of for the trailer. And I think that really then brings us to the end of our categories. We could, like you mentioned, probably have an episode on rabbit holes on several of these options to further explore them. But in terms of really looking at the big picture, I think these are all the setups I've seen, with the exception of a motorcycle and a ground tent. But I think that's a lot of the same pros and cons. It's like we talked about with the ground tent, except you have even less storage space available and less ability to bring stuff. So you got to be really creative and inventive about what you do bring.
Yep.
We started talking about at the beginning of the show just being willing to get started with whatever you've got and learning what you like and where you want to make compromises. But I think our other big advice would be that if you can try out some of these setups before committing to them through rentals, that is a fantastic option. Or if you know a friend who has a setup that you're considering, see if you could take their rig out and just get a feel for not only how it drives, how easy it is to set up and tear down, and what the experience is like to actually sleep in it. So we just had our friend Will Curry on last week, who rents out campers up here in the Pacific Northwest. So if you want to try out a teardrop trailer, be a great option to look at with Camp Ridge. Doing something similar in the Colorado area, I had previously mentioned Titus Adventures. A friend of a friend runs that company, and they rent out vans as well as 4x4s with rooftop tents. So if you're curious to try out those two kind of vehicle platforms, you should check out Titus Adventures.
Yep. There's another company, Alaska Overland, that does the rentals of 4x4s with rooftop tents out of Alaska. And there's one out here in Seattle as well.
Cool. Yeah. So that could be a great way of just getting a feel for it and seeing if that's something you really want to commit to.
And then tons of vans available on Outdoorsy.
Yeah, so that's true. My parents have even rented through Outdoorsy before just to try that out. Yeah. I think with that, we'll wrap it up for today, unless there's any other considerations that you would.
I think the one thing, just going back to some of our earlier ones, sort of the low barrier to entry stops, some things to think about if you're going to try out sleeping inside the car. Definitely think about ventilation and having some sort of solution where you could have a window cracked open but still have a screen, that's money well spent. Your sleeping pad and how it goes flat is money well spent. And just things that I think both Megan and Alex realized and could negatively impact the experience of that quite dramatically, but are so easy to overcome.
Yeah, certainly thinking through temperature and how comfortable you actually are on your sleeping surface. Those are the two biggest things I think that impacts if I actually get a good night's sleep. So really good points. Let us know if you've got any other questions for us. We'd love to hear them. You can message or comment at blueyondergen or blueyonderadventures on Instagram, and we'll repost some of the behind the scenes stuff of Matt's evolution of his rigs, and you can kind of see the pros and cons and compromises that he was thinking through. But if you do have follow-up questions, we'd love to hear them and address them on a later episode. As Matt said, we'll probably do a deep dive on some of these with experts in each of these platforms for later episodes. So join us then.
Awesome.
Hi friends, if you're looking for any of the links mentioned in this episode, I'll be posting those online at blueyonder-adventures.com. If you listened all the way to the end of this episode, thanks so much for your time today. And if you are curious to learn more about overlanding, I'd recommend going back to our first 2 episodes, which talk about what exactly it is, why we love it so much, and how to find great campsites. I'll also have plenty of other behind-the-scenes content, photos, footage, and references to other great people to follow over at blueyondergen on Instagram or Threads, so feel free to contact me there. And I'll be back next week with more.